The grand reading rooms of the mid-19th century were monuments to public enlightenment. Marble staircases, vaulted ceilings, shelving that stretched toward skylights designed to flood thousands of volumes with natural light. But in 1850, literacy rates in most American cities hovered between 40 and 60%. In Britain, the figure was similar. The working class, who these libraries claimed to serve, had little time to read. Books were expensive. Borrowing systems were underdeveloped. Yet the Boston Public Library, when it opened in 1854, was built to house 600,000 volumes. At the time of its construction, the city's entire literary output barely filled a quarter of that space. The architects weren't guessing. They were preparing for readers who didn't yet exist. This documentary explores architectural preparation, institutional timing, and the possibility that some infrastructure wasn't built for the society that funded it, but for a framework that already existed in collective memory. We'll examine evidence. We'll compare timelines. We'll observe patterns that appear across continents within the same narrow window of years. This isn't about conspiracy. It's about timing. And the uncomfortable possibility that scale sometimes precedes demand by design. The Astor Library in New York opened in 1854. It could seat 300 readers. The city's population was around 600,000, but fewer than half could read fluently, and most worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Who was this building for? The Peabody Institute in Baltimore followed in 1857. Its reading room could accommodate 200 people simultaneously. Baltimore's population was just over 200,000. Literacy was inconsistent. Public education was fragmented. The building's capacity suggested an audience that hadn't arrived. But the architecture didn't wait. Across the Atlantic, the same pattern emerged. The British Museum Reading Room, completed in 1857, was a perfect circle, 140 feet in diameter, seating for 300, shelving for over 1 million volumes. At the time, Britain's literacy rate among the working class, the demographic these institutions claimed to serve, was estimated at 60%. And that figure measured the ability to sign one's name, not to read a book. The timing raises questions. These weren't small projects. They required decades of planning, enormous capital investment, and architectural precision that suggested long-term institutional vision. But the readers weren't there yet. The Free Library of Philadelphia broke ground in 1891, but its design was rooted in plans from the 1870s. It was built to serve a city of 300,000 readers in a population of just over 1 million. The problem: in 1870, Philadelphia's public school enrollment was inconsistent. Child labor was common. Adult literacy, especially among immigrants, lagged behind the city's ambitions. Yet the shelving was installed. The cataloging systems were designed. The reading rooms were furnished, as if the readers were already expected. What's notable isn't just the scale, it's the simultaneity. Between 1848 and 1870, major public libraries appeared in Boston, New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, London, Manchester, and Dublin, all within a 22-year window. All designed with capacity that exceeded immediate demand. All funded by civic institutions that, in many cases, were themselves only a few decades old. The coordination wasn't explicit. There was no centralized directive. But the architectural logic was nearly identical. Neoclassical facades. Central reading rooms with natural light. Cataloging systems modeled on European precedents. Open stacks, or at least the structural capacity for them. It's as if the same institutional blueprint was being applied across multiple cities, in multiple countries, by committees that had never met. Consider the timeline more closely. Public libraries as civic institutions barely existed before 1848. The concept of free universal access to books was radical. In most cities, reading rooms were private clubs. Collections were restricted. Then, within 2 decades, the model changed. Not gradually, not experimentally. Simultaneously. The Boston Public Library's charter in 1848 explicitly stated it would serve all citizens. The British Museum Reading Room, just 9 years later, adopted a similar ethos. The Free Library of Philadelphia followed in the 1870s. These weren't isolated decisions. They reflected a shared understanding of what a library should be, an understanding that appeared nearly fully formed in the mid-19th century. Where did that understanding come from? The architectural preparation is harder to dismiss. The New York Public Library's Central Branch, completed in 1911, was designed to hold 7 million volumes. In 1911, the library's collection numbered just over 1 million. The architects knew. They built for a future they couldn't see, but could apparently measure. The same logic applied in smaller cities. The Carnegie Libraries, funded by Andrew Carnegie starting in 1883, were built with excess capacity. Storage rooms designed for acquisitions that hadn't been purchased. Reading rooms sized for populations that hadn't yet learned to read. Carnegie himself called it scientific philanthropy. But the science was prescriptive, not descriptive. It anticipated demand. It didn't respond to it. There's a pattern here that doesn't resolve easily. Libraries built before the readers existed. Shelving installed before the books arrived. Cataloging systems designed for collections that were still decades away. The official explanation is forward-thinking philanthropy, visionary donors, civic optimism. And that explanation works, until you compare the numbers. In 1850, Boston's library could house 600,000 volumes for a city where fewer than 100,000 people could read comfortably. That's not optimism. That's structural certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing what's already there, or what used to be. The pattern wasn't limited to reading rooms. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened across New York State. It was 363 miles long. It connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. It cost $7 million, roughly $200 million in today's currency. The population it served was sparse. Western New York was farmland, small towns, scattered settlements. The canal's capacity could move 2,000 tons per day. But in 1825, there wasn't enough cargo in the region to justify half that volume. Within 10 years, the canal was operating at full capacity. The infrastructure had been waiting. The same logic appeared in Britain. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened in 1830. It was the first intercity passenger railway in the world. It could transport 1,200 passengers per day. Manchester's population in 1830 was around 180,000. Liverpool's was similar. Most people didn't travel between cities. The working class couldn't afford it. The middle class had no regular need. Yet the railway was built for continuous traffic. And within 5 years it was oversubscribed. The demand appeared, as if it had been waiting for the infrastructure to catch up. This wasn't isolated to transportation. In the 1840s, American cities began installing municipal water systems on a scale that exceeded immediate need. Philadelphia's Fairmount Water Works, completed in 1815, could pump 3 million gallons per day. The city's population required less than half that. New York's Croton Aqueduct, finished in 1842, delivered 90 million gallons per day to a city of 300,000 people. That's 300 gallons per person per day. For context, modern usage averages around 80 gallons per person per day. The system was built for a city 3 times larger than the one that funded it. The timing is difficult to ignore. Between 1815 and 1860, infrastructure projects across the United States and Britain followed the same pattern. Build first, populate later. Canals before cargo. Railways before passengers. Water systems before demand. It's presented as foresight. But foresight requires a model, a projection, some basis for anticipating growth. In most of these cases, the projections didn't exist. Census data was unreliable. Immigration patterns were unpredictable. Economic growth was speculative. Yet the infrastructure was precise. Not approximate. Not experimental. Precise. The administrative systems appeared with the same timing. In 1837, Britain established civil registration, standardized birth, marriage, and death records. Before that, record-keeping was inconsistent, managed by local parishes with no central oversight. The system was implemented nationally within 2 years. The United States followed a similar trajectory. By 1850, the federal census had become standardized. Categories were uniform. Questions were identical across states. Data was centralized. This wasn't a gradual evolution. It was systematic adoption. And it happened simultaneously with the infrastructure boom. Libraries, canals, railways, water systems, civil records. All within the same 30-year window. All built or implemented with a level of coordination that official histories describe as coincidental. Consider the scale of the New York Public Library's main branch again. Construction began in 1902. It took 9 years. The building occupies 2 full city blocks. It has 88 miles of shelving. In 1902, New York's population was 3.4 million. Literacy rates had improved, but access to books remained limited for most working-class families. The library was designed to serve 10 million people. The architects weren't guessing. They had blueprints, floor plans, load-bearing calculations for future expansions that wouldn't occur for another 50 years. How do you design for a future you can't predict, unless the design isn't new? The Carnegie Libraries offer another angle. Between 1883 and 1929, Andrew Carnegie funded 2,509 libraries. Most were built in small towns. Many had populations under 5,000. The buildings followed a template: neoclassical facades, central reading rooms, basement storage designed for collections that didn't yet exist. Carnegie's philanthropy is celebrated as visionary. But the vision was architectural, not social. He didn't survey towns to assess demand. He didn't wait for communities to request libraries. He built them. And the communities adapted. The same pattern appears in Britain's municipal library movement. The Public Libraries Act of 1850 allowed towns to levy taxes for library construction. By 1870, over 30 cities had built central libraries. The buildings were nearly identical. Same floor plans, same cataloging systems, same shelving ratios. It's as if the design already existed and was being distributed. Not created, distributed. There's a deeper question embedded in the infrastructure. Why were these systems over-engineered? The Erie Canal didn't need to be 363 miles long in 1825. A shorter route would have sufficed for the existing demand. The Croton Aqueduct didn't need to deliver 90 million gallons per day in 1842. Half that capacity would have been generous. The Boston Public Library didn't need shelving for 600,000 volumes in 1854. A quarter of that would have exceeded the city's literary output. But the projects weren't scaled to present need. They were scaled to future certainty. The administrative uniformity deepens the pattern. By 1860, census formats across the United States were nearly identical. The same questions, the same categories, the same methods of data collection. This wasn't accidental. It required coordination, training, institutional memory. But the institutions responsible, state governments, federal agencies, were themselves only decades old. Where did the expertise come from? Britain's civil registration system, implemented in 1837, used the same logic. Standardized forms, centralized archives, uniform procedures. It was rolled out nationally within 2 years, across a country with inconsistent local governance and widespread administrative resistance. How do you implement a system that complex, that quickly, without a template? The library systems show the same logic. The Dewey Decimal System, introduced in 1876, became the global standard for library cataloging within 20 years. It wasn't debated. It wasn't tested regionally. It was adopted, as if the need for a universal system was already understood. There's a phrase that appears in 19th century municipal records with surprising frequency: in accordance with standard practice. But the standards weren't documented. They weren't published in manuals or debated in legislative sessions. They were assumed. Libraries were built in accordance with standard practice. Water systems were designed the same way. Railways followed suit. The phrase implies an existing framework, a framework that didn't need to be explained because it was already known. Whether this reflects inheritance, convergence, or parallel development is open to interpretation. But the timing is narrow, the coordination is precise, and the infrastructure consistently precedes the population it claims to serve. The question isn't whether these projects were ambitious. It's whether they were responsive or restorative. The word Tartaria appears on European maps between the 15th and 19th centuries. It referred to the vast interior of Asia, a region European cartographers knew little about. The term was geographic, not political, a placeholder for uncertainty. By the 1850s, the label had mostly disappeared from official maps. But the timing is notable. The same decades that saw Tartaria erased from cartography also saw the appearance of standardized infrastructure, municipal libraries, and civil record systems across Europe and North America. 2 processes. 1 window. In recent years, the term has been reinterpreted. Online communities use Tartaria not as a geographic label, but as a metaphor, a way of asking whether 19th century infrastructure was built from scratch, or whether it represented the reorganization of something older. This interpretation is speculative. It's not supported by mainstream academic consensus, but it offers a framework for examining the patterns we've discussed. There are 3 ways to interpret the evidence. The first is conventional historiography, visionary planning, rapid industrialization, coordinated civic investment driven by Enlightenment ideals and capitalist ambition. This explanation accounts for most of the timeline. It fits the accepted narrative. It doesn't require revision, but it struggles with the precision, the simultaneity, the over-engineering. The second interpretation is convergent development. Independent cities, facing similar challenges, arrived at similar solutions within the same time frame. This explains the architectural uniformity, the shared cataloging systems, the standardized record keeping, but it requires an extraordinary level of coincidence. That dozens of cities across 2 continents would adopt nearly identical infrastructure models within 20 years, without centralized coordination, is statistically improbable. Possible, but improbable. The third interpretation is inheritance. That the infrastructure of the mid-19th century wasn't entirely new, that it restored, reorganized, or adapted systems that already existed in some form. This interpretation treats Tartaria not as a lost empire, but as a label for a period of reorganization, a moment when institutional memory was formalized into physical infrastructure. It doesn't require a conspiracy. It doesn't demand hidden civilizations. It simply suggests that the mid-19th century wasn't building from zero. Return to 1816, the year without a summer. Volcanic eruptions in Indonesia disrupted global climate. Crops failed. Populations migrated. Governments destabilized. Within 2 decades, the infrastructure boom began. Canals, railways, libraries, water systems, civil records. The official explanation is recovery and progress. Nations rebuilding after disruption. But the projects weren't emergency measures. They were long-term installations, designed with excess capacity, built to serve populations that didn't yet exist. If this was recovery, what was being recovered? The Tartarian interpretation offers one possible answer, that the infrastructure wasn't invented in the 19th century, it was reinstalled. That the systems we attribute to Victorian ingenuity may have been adaptations of frameworks that predated the disruption. This is speculative. It's not provable with the evidence presented here. But it's also not disprovable. The evidence invites examination, not conclusion. Libraries built before readers. Railways before passengers. Water systems before cities. Administrative uniformity appearing across nations within years. Cataloging systems adopted without debate. Architectural templates distributed without documentation. These patterns don't demand a single explanation, but they resist easy dismissal. The term Tartaria functions in this context as a placeholder, not for a lost empire, but for the possibility that the 19th century reorganized as much as it invented. That some of what we credit to progress may have been restoration. That the infrastructure we study as innovation may carry the memory of something older. This documentary hasn't provided answers. It's presented timing, scale, coordination. It's asked whether the libraries were built for the future, or for a demand that was already understood. Whether the railways anticipated growth, or responded to a template. Whether the administrative systems were invented, or remembered. The evidence remains open. The infrastructure is still standing. The records are accessible. The timelines are documented. What they mean depends on which framework you apply, and which questions you're willing to ask. The reading halls are still there. Marble staircases, vaulted ceilings, shelving for millions of volumes, built before the readers existed, or built because someone knew they would return.